So, but John wanted to take you, so that's why there's, yeah. Then my daughter's party.
It's run by parents. Run by not necessarily on the county.
All right. I'll check back out.
Oh, no worries. If everyone can find a seat, we'll get started here in just a moment.
Thank you. I'm not gonna try to say it there that you don't do.
All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of our president, Anthony McDonald, I'd like to welcome you to our spring forum today. I'm very much looking forward to our speaker and to our time together. My name is Adam Gibson-Even. I serve as Vice President of the Northwest Indiana African American Alliance. Most of our board members are here today. Maybe you guys could just raise your hands. You can see us scattered around the room. So if you want to, I'll say a few things about the organization, but if you want to hear more, find me or one of those folks afterwards. Thank you to Linda in particular and the First Presbyterian, Pastor Julia, and others for hosting us today. We appreciate it. So as an organization, our vision statements to create a network that assists in the movement towards racial equality, social equality, and racial accountability within the region of Northwest Indiana. And our mission to engage public and private entities through advocacy and education. Our goal is to find solutions to the prevailing issues that impede the progress and empowerment of African American communities in Northwest Indiana. So I'll mention a couple of our upcoming activities in particular, and you've got leaflets, half pages there on your table. So Saturday, May 18th, back here at the Presbyterian Church, our Community Leadership Achievement Awards, which is one of my favorite events. We'll recognize 3 individuals or couples this year and get to hear about some of their activities in our community. I always learn a lot at those events. Lunch will be served. RSVPs are encouraged, and you've got the details on the flyer there. But 1 to 3 o'clock coming up Saturday, May 18th. Then in June, our traditional summertime gathering in the park at Kirchhoff Park, June 22nd, another Saturday, 12 to 3 o'clock. For families, but for the community as well, hot dogs, games, a bounce house, partnering with the Valparaiso Police Department as we have for many years. Otherwise, our main activities are fall and spring forums like this one. We have Black History Month programming also. So if you've left us your contact information on the sign-in sheet, so we'll be sure to let you know when we have events going on. As if you want to be more involved, as a board, we meet monthly. So if you want to hear about how to get more actively involved with the group, again, catch me or one of the board members, and we're happy to tell you more about that and connect you with our monthly meetings. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Pat to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for coming here today. My name is Pat Wisniewski. I'm a board member and an ally for the Northwest Indiana African American Alliance. And I'm here to introduce this wonderful young woman here, Madolyn Wesaw. Madolyn is a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. She serves her community through her role as chairwoman of the Pokagon Band Representation Outreach Board. She has been awarded Good Path Emerging Leader Award. Madolyn has previously worked alongside institutions such as the Newberry Library and the Chicago Public Library, as well as others. She resides in Dowagiac, Michigan, with her son, Eron, also many thunders boy. Welcome.
My PowerPoint thing out there. Can everybody see that okay? Yes. Yeah, okay, cool. Bonjour, Madolyn Wesaw, Indigenous Neenan Nodeno KWE Bodewasmik Mina Odawa Michigan Dodem Dowagiac and Nimakee KAA Gweezans and Gweez. Hello, everybody. My name is Madolyn. I am enrolled with Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. I am also an Odawa woman as well. And I live in Dowagiac, Michigan with my son, Eron, and we are a turtle clan. So first I want to say miigwech. Thank you everybody for having me here today. It's a pleasure to speak with you guys and any opportunity really to share about my people and build those connections with the communities that we all call home. I think it's very important. Let me move this way. Okay, so what I normally speak on, my subject matter is typically Indigenous representation and what that looks like in the modern world. I was asked to also give a little bit of background and history on my tribe and who we are as a people. And so I reached out to my tribe's Center for History and Culture, and they provided us with this little presentation slideshow here, which I'll share with you now. I think it's really important to note before we get started that anything that I share with you here today is not my knowledge. These are not my teachings. These are things that have been passed to me by people in my community. And it's also important to recognize that Indigenous people do not operate as a monolith. So the things that are true for me as a Pokagon woman might be different for somebody who is a Huron band member, or somebody who is Odawa or Ojibwe, or even within the same tribe, we operate on clan systems as well, and different clans, even down to different families, have different teachings. So it's important to recognize that just because something might be true for myself, maybe that's not true for my cousin or for somebody who is Bear Clan, for example. In the United States alone, there are over, I think 600 to 700 different nations. Each nation, we all have our own language, our own culture, our own religion, our own ways of being. And I think that's something that has been kind of lost in America post-colonization. There's been sort of a, we've been grouped into one group, and then we have been othered. And a lot of the things that make us unique and the things that we have to offer as Indigenous people have kind of been lost as a result of that. So let's go ahead and get started with our little history presentation here. So history typically is told from a very European perspective. The history of the United States is often told from, and depending, usually from the Mayflower or from 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We know all about that, but it's really important to recognize that there is a very rich and complex history in these lands prior to that time as well. Excuse me, with colonization, sort of came a narrative that Indigenous people were savages, that we were primitive, that we were less than, that we were, a people to be feared, people without lawlessness or order, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Prior to colonization, our people had very complex knowledge systems. We had star knowledge, agriculture, mathematics, medicine. We had dramatically longer lifespans actually than the original European settlers who came to this land because we had such advanced technology. But maybe because it was a little bit unfamiliar, or maybe for other reasons, we were labeled as needing the help of the original settlers in this country.
Did you want questions during or at the end?
Yeah, anytime. So I forgot to mention actually, so when I present to people, I really like for it to be more of a conversation. I don't want to just talk at you this whole time. So if you guys have questions, definitely feel free to ask. If we start getting a lot of questions at the same time, we might hold just a little bit more towards the end, but yeah, feel free to, did you have a question? Or?
Well, aren't so many of our medicines based on so many of the things that you use, or your tribe, whatever, used or discovered?
Yeah, so that was a good question. If you guys couldn't hear, the question was, aren't a lot of modern medicines based on medicines that our people had? Yeah, a lot of it is, but then there's also kind of an attitude of well, this is very ancient knowledge, so it must be I don't know, spooky, or, it must be an old wives' tale, and that's not true. We have a saying that, Anishinaabe people, we have a cure for everything. And so yeah, and a lot of Native people do rely on our traditional healers still to this day. Sometimes we call them I think pop culture has a tendency to kind of label them as like these mystic beings, like shamans and medicine man. And I don't know why they're painted that way. It's really just knowledge, like a doctor. So yes, we call those individuals our helpers, and we do rely on them a lot still. So way back in the day, in the early days of the settlers and colonialism, our people were sometimes known as either the St. Joseph Potawatomi, or even the Catholic Potawatomi. So sometimes you'll hear us referred to as many different things, but who they're talking about when they say that is us, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. The Greater Potawatomi Nation in general, a lot of us stayed kind of in this Great Lakes region, but some of us were also subject to removal under the Indian Removal Acts. And those individuals were sent many different places. We have relatives in Canada, Oklahoma, Kansas, Mexico even. So like the Prairie Band and the Citizen Band, for example, of Potawatomi, they're going to be out more west in like Kansas and Mexico. Let's see, I already covered that. So also, just for some context, I refer to us as like Anishinaabe. And so what that means is the people. And so you'll hear a lot of Great Lakes region indigenous people refer to ourselves as the Anishinaabe. So prior to colonization, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, we actually all existed together as one great nation. And it was only after colonization that we were separated and had these borders put in place for us. And so I had mentioned earlier too that different families and different clans might have different teachings as well, right? And so clan structures are extremely important in our societies and in our ways. Different clans have different roles and responsibilities. So myself, I am Michigandotum. That means that I am Turtle Clan. And so my responsibilities oftentimes have to do with the water and protecting the water, but also sort of like an intellectual role, a leader in that way. Not myself personally, but my clan, and peacekeeping at times as well.
Who leads the clan and gives these roles to the members?
Nobody. That was a really good question. So who leads the clans and hands out these roles? Nobody does. These are just our ways. These are things that have been passed down to us from our ancestors. And so we know that, if you're Bear Clan, your role might be more so like peacekeeping and enforcing rules. And if you're Turtle Clan, you kind of know what your roles are within the community that way. But actually, no one's really like the big guy in charge, if that makes sense. We have individuals who have stepped up and are, they are our helpers and they are seen as leaders. But we don't operate the same way that a lot of like Eastern power structures are set up. No one individual is more important than the next. And so it's really too, when it comes to operating within those traditional cultural roles, it's really up to the individual to decide if they want to do that or not, which is actually another really good point, something that I talk about often. We call it walking in two worlds. As indigenous people, we have a really unique challenge that we have to figure out how to exist and how to survive both in the Western world, within the scope of the United States, but also within our cultural spheres. Because a lot of times the things that Western society expects out of us directly contradict what we know and what we believe as indigenous people. And so you have to find that balance. And sometimes it can be really hard because I've never felt excluded or like I didn't belong within my indigenous community, but I do often feel that way when operating in Western spheres. Like it's a little scary sometimes to be like indigenous out loud, because you are othered and you know how different you are, even if you don't say anything or try to hide it, people will always treat you differently. And there are a lot of stereotypes of indigenous people that exist. There's the noble savage or the ignoble savage. Sometimes they view us as being these like Pocahontas-like beings where, can we like speak to animals? And no, we can't. We are just people like everybody else at the end of the day. But there seem to be really weird expectations that are placed on us in outside society sometimes. And there is a lot of pressure to meet those expectations for some reason. So even though in our rational brains, at least in my experience, I know that it's not my responsibility to meet anybody's expectations of who I am or who I should be. But I do often find that when I'm asked for my opinion or when I voice my opinion on things in the Western world, if people feel that I'm not native enough, they'll dismiss me, which you know, who is to judge who is Native and who isn't? Why is it up to anyone else to decide that because I don't dress a certain way or I don't look a certain way that my opinion as an Indigenous woman is invalid? And that typically only comes from people outside of the Indigenous sphere who feel like they have that right to tell me how I should look as a Native woman. And so when we talk about walking in two worlds, I know many of you probably know Native people yourselves. So it's really important to keep in mind just that pressure that we experience, and just keep in mind that no matter what, however we choose to present ourselves or carry ourselves, our identities as Indigenous people is valid. Doesn't matter what we look like, doesn't matter how traditional we are, it doesn't matter if we speak the language, it doesn't matter. If we are Indigenous, we are Indigenous, and that's for us to decide how much we want to incorporate into our own lives.
So how are disagreements handled
Yeah.
on yourselves?
Yeah, that was a good question. So the question was about disagreements. Disagreements happen all the time, right? People, for whatever reason. There are, like in the modern world, we do have the option to, you know, like if parents are getting divorced, you have the option to go to court to settle custody and all that good stuff. But we do also have traditional peacekeepers who exist within our community as well. So that would be sort of like mediation, I guess, would be the closest thing that I can compare that to. So if two people are having a disagreement, it could be divorce or custody or land disputes, or even just two people are arguing, you know, and have like personal problems. You can go before a traditional peacekeeper and they will sit you down and they will have you smudge. Smudge is sage typically, and what that does, it doesn't necessarily like expel negative energy, but it just kind of like sets the tone, and it reminds you to be positive and to not bring your negativity into the conversation, and to kind of cleanse your body of any of that bad feeling. And then you sit down and you just work it out. You talk, you sit there until you figure it out. So yeah, that seems to be pretty effective. Yeah. Okay. So here on the screen, we have, this is an interpretation of a birch bark scroll map, and that represents the migration of the Three Fires Confederacy. So that was us, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa that I had mentioned earlier. And this depicts the migration west from the St. Lawrence Seaway or the Atlantic Ocean. Let's see here. Oh, did it skip on the screen? No, okay. That's just my computer then. Okay. And so we also have a creation story. Most religions and most belief systems do have creation stories. I do also want to preface that a lot of our stories, a lot of our sacred stories, we don't tell them unless there's a layer of snow on the ground. And that's to kind of keep, when you're speaking about those ancient and really powerful spirits, you want to keep them below. And so that blanket of snow kind of helps to keep them where they're at, because we don't want to call them forth necessarily. We want to let them rest and do what they need to do. And so I'm going to share, this is my son's favorite story, so I'll share it with you guys now, but this is the creation story of what we call Turtle Island, which is this continent essentially. And so the story goes that there was a great flood, which, you know, in Christianity, there's the great flood that happened. Also, we have the same story. And so basically what happened was our creator, Gashemnado, he saw that Native people, we weren't really living right. We were getting a little bit lazy, not treating each other very well. And so he sent a flood to reset the land, essentially. And our first man, his name was Nanabojo. So Nanabojo, he got onto this canoe and he brought a couple of animals with him, similar to Noah and Noah's Ark, right? Except it was a canoe, so it's much smaller. And so Nanabojo, he gets on this canoe and he has a couple of different animals with him. And they were feeling a little bit of despair, right? Because what are they going to do? Where are they going to live? They can't stay in this canoe forever. And so Mashike, the turtle, he stepped up and he said that he would sacrifice his shell. And if somebody could get to the bottom of all that water and pull up some dirt, that they could put that dirt on the back of his shell and it would grow and people could live there. So he would sacrifice himself that way for our people. And so there were a lot of different animals on the canoe, and they had different talents. Some were very fast, some were very strong, some were very good swimmers. And so they all volunteered to go to the bottom and to try to find some land, but all of them failed. It was too far down. And so finally, the muskrat, or Zheshko volunteered himself. He said, I'll go. And the other animals, they all kind of laughed at him because he's just a tiny little guy, you know, and none of the bigger, stronger animals have been able to get to the bottom. So how is Jeshko gonna get there? But he gave it a try anyways. And he dove all the way to the bottom and he didn't come up for a real long time. And so all the other animals, they started to get really nervous and they thought something had happened to him and he was lost and they were giving up hope. And then all of a sudden they see some bubbles start to come to the surface and they got excited because Jeshko made it. They didn't think he had gotten any of the earth, but at least he was coming back, right? So Jeshko floats up to the top, but he doesn't really come out of the water. Jeshko had perished in his attempt to get that earth from the bottom of the flood. And so Nanak Bojo, he was sad. He was in mourning for his friend that had just died. And so he picked up Jeshko out of the water and he realized that he had his little fist closed. And when they opened his fist, he had earth. He had dirt in his little fist. And so they took that dirt out of Jeshko's fist and they spread it across the back of that turtle. And that's where the land that we live on now comes from. Yeah, so it's a powerful story, right? Yeah, so Jeshko and Mashike, they sacrifice themselves, and now we have Turtle Island, and that's this land here. And so you'll often hear it referred to as Turtle Island by a lot of Indigenous people in these places. And it's an important story because it reminds us, A, don't count out the underdog, right? Even the tiny little guys are capable of really big things. And to have courage in the face of adversity, and also reminds us of the importance and the value of being willing to sacrifice for the better of your people. And there are different origin stories, you know, even between the Potawatomi and the Ojibwe and the Odawa, but they're all pretty similar, and that's what we believe here in these lands. Let's see here. One of the other origin stories claims that there were some Anishinaabe people who were particularly gifted in that they were able to receive like visions from our creator, from Gishemnado. And some of those individuals received a vision, sort of like what? Why are words failing me now? Like they could kind of see into the future and they had this vision that they needed to move east if they wanted to survive, because the creator had told them that there were people who were going to come across the Great Sea and they were going to cause a lot of conflict and a lot of turmoil for our people. And if we wanted to survive what was coming, we had to move east, in particular to the place where the Minoman or the wild rice grows. And so that's why wild rice was served here today and why it's such an important food for our people, because we believe that we depend on it for our survival as Anishinaabe people. And the vision stated, I think in particular, like specifically what Minoman means is the food that grows on water. So Great Lakes region, this is where we came. And so that's how come we settled in this area. Others say that there was Anishinaabe, Nene, and Kwek, man and woman, who were accompanied by white dogs who were summoned by Gishemnado himself to rise out of Lake Michigan and take the form of a human from red earth or red clay. And the Meskwaki people also kind of believe something very similar. So they refer to themselves as red earth people or red clay people. And so in that way, you'll also see a lot of similarities between, even though we are all different, there's a lot of similarities between us and other Indigenous nations. But what's really, I guess, the important thing out of this is that all three nations in the Three Fires Confederacy, we all have different responsibilities. Some are the keepers of trade, and then of tradition, and the Potawatomi were the keepers of the fire, both like literally and metaphorically. And so we know that if we're going to continue to survive, and even in these days, the world is kind of in a bit of turmoil right now, right? And so we understand that it's really important for us to come together as one people, and to keep that fire going, you know, physically and spiritually. Also, if I'm talking too fast or anything, please let me know. So up here, this is a more contemporary map that is a representation of the migration routes and some offshoot groups and kind of where they went. And so you'll see that a lot of places, a lot of like states and countries and cities, they actually have names that are Anishinaabe in origin. So like, anyway, sorry. You can see on the map here. And then, oh, let me go back there. So the main root's origin is around the New Brunswick and Maine area, and then that goes southwest through New York. And then there's kind of a fork where some headed north into Canada around Lake Superior, and then others went west into Michigan. And even up into the UP in Wisconsin. Some people stayed out in the New Brunswick or the Maine area, and they're known as the Wabanaki. Wabin meaning east and Aki meaning earth. So very literal name for those individuals. In modern times, you may also hear them referred to as the Delaware, and who still reside in that area to this day. So if you didn't know, Delaware is an Anishinaabe word. So I have a little video for you here. It is on YouTube, so there might be a little bit of an ad if you guys don't mind. But this is some of our history as narrated by Kyle Malat, who is just like a wealth of knowledge, very powerful individual within our community. He's also a language keeper. So I'm going to put that on the screen for you now.
Our band of Potawatomi plays just a small role in this vast history of our Potawatomi nation. In this video, we'll cover just a few different sites around this area here. Although there are hundreds and hundreds of village sites across the Great Lakes. Born in 1720, Neenan Nodeno, known as Quivering Tail, known as Nanakiba, rose to become a strong leader of the Potawatomi along the St. Joseph River. He was the principal chief of the Potawatomi. In the 1750s, while siding with the French against the British, the top British general Edward Braddock was killed. During this battle, Nanakiba and his men acquired 200 British horses, bringing a new mode of transportation to the St. Joseph Valley. The next highest ranking general under Braddock was a young George Washington. Where we are here today, this is the Dowagiac Creek that flows right into the St. Joseph River. This is just over there. Now, what's significant about this area is right there on the other side of this creek here is what was Nanakiba's village. This is also the birthplace of Topnaby. So this village was back in the 1750s, where the St. Joseph River meets the Dowagiac Creek. That's the area where that village inhabited.
Why are you not investing in taxes? No, seriously. Why are you not in?
We'll just mute this guy.
Forces 88 Potawatomi, 70 from the St. Joseph, including Nanakiba's group, and 18 from Detroit set sail for southern end of Lake George to take on British forces at Fort William Henry in New York. After the French allowed the British to surrender, the St. Joseph Potawatomi, having traveled so far, stormed the fort, killing many people. In this raid of the fort, Potawatomi came in contact with smallpox and brought it back as they returned into the St. Joseph River, creating an epidemic to our people. Nanakiba, however, survived this. Nanakiba died in 1790. He had 6 children who became important leaders of their time. 5 sons, Topnaby, Dokmabah, which means he who sits quietly, Zawanamnuk, which means where the yellow ochre is, Sawak, which refers to the yellow color, Chizagan, which is a big lake, and Shabas, which is she-bass. She-bass is a little duck. He also had 1 daughter called Kama, whose real name was Gagagama, which means forever lake. Preceding his death, Nanakiba's oldest son, Topnaby, was chosen to be the next leader for the St. Joseph Potawatomi. Topnaby, or Dokmabah, was born in 1758, but we first hear of him at the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. Known as one of the greatest leaders of the Potawatomi, Topnaby, along with Pokagon, instead of fighting American expansion, decided to adopt and practice ways of agriculture, farming, and Catholicism, which had previously been introduced and practiced as early as the 1600s. In the early 1800s, tensions were high between the tribes in the United States. A Shawnee by the name of Tecumseh aligned his groups along with the British in the War of 1812 in order to stop the American expansion. Some Potawatomi joined Tecumseh. However, Topnaby and his band disagreed with this approach and decided to use treaties as a way of negotiation. So we are here at what is now called Lake And the reason for that is just south of this lake here, but US 12. US 12 is the old soft trail. That's from all the way over to Detroit, all the way over here. There's connecting trails that attach to it. But on the other side of US 12 right there, just on the south side of this lake, was a village, and that village was called Swapduk. Swapduk. Swapduk means 30. The reason for that is if you take Old Sock Trail US 12 30 miles west, you will run into another village that was run by Tupper. And that's New Buffalo, right on Lake Michigan. So what was happening there is in the fall and the winter time, our people would be camped out here in this village in Swapduk. We would be here, kinds of heat. Now, in the spring and summertime, deer get a type of a parasite that will eat that meat, will go bad. Now, go down to Lake Michigan, would be living off of lake trout and fish that would get off of Lake Michigan. Under the Treaty of Chicago, 1821, this village was introduced here, and there was the one over in Buffalo. He brought his village into Niles, Michigan, and over by where the hospital is at. Now, I mentioned Swapduk means 30 because 30 miles that way, you have another village in New Buffalo. Now, that village in New Buffalo was called Dowagiac. Dowagiac. And also later on, he set up a village here in Niles, like Gary mentioned. And that was also called Dowagiac. Dowagiac means place of harvesting, gathering, and foraging. After the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, Reverend Isaac McCoy was to start a mission school for the Potawatomi in Niles, Michigan. This took place along near Topnabee's village. With such a big change in the Anishinaabe lifestyle of signing away land and adopting to farming and new ways of agriculture, Topnabee turned to alcohol, which eventually was his demise. On July 27, 1826, Isaac McCoy records the death of Topnabee. The principal chief fell from his horse under influence of ardent spirits and received an injury of which he died 2 days afterwards. Topnabee passed away in 1826. He had 5 children, 2 sons. One was Topnabee the younger, and Wabji. Wabji is a swan. He also had 3 daughters, Sinajwin, Memagwe, and Gatas, later known as Elizabeth Topnabee. Topnabee had adopted many people ceremonially during his life, including Leopold Pokagon and Madolyn Bertrand. He was also the father-in-law to both Madolyn Wesaw and Leopold Pokagon through his second wife. First recorded by Isaac McCoy in 1823, a new village of Potawatomi set up not far from Topnabee's village, led by Pokagon. Pokagon, or Pokagon, means a rib. His original name was actually Sakiunik, which means man of the outlet. He was born in a village near present-day Saugatuck, Michigan. He was born to Odawa and Ojibwe parents and later taken in by Topnabee, who called him Pokagon. Pokagon grew to become a very influential leader and was second in command under Topnabee.
There's one simple vision hack anyone can use to enhance their sight almost overnight.
It's like they know when it's getting good.
Okay. So right on the other side of this camera here is the town of Bertrand. This is where our people used to come trade during Pokagon's time. So right over on the other side here, the St. Joe River on the other side of these trees. And on the other side of the St. Joe River was Pokagon's village. We would travel over here and had a really good relationship with people in this village here. Pokagon was never really a big fan of Isaac McCoy, which is one of the reasons he set up his village away from the mission. And in 1830, Pokagon decided to travel to Detroit to bring back a black robe, or a Mactauquinette, one who wears black, back to the St. Joseph Potawatomi. There he met with Father Gabriel Richard, who first denied the request. Then Pokagon began to recite Catholic prayers in his language, to which Richard said, "You will have your black robe." Pokagon returned with Father Stephen Baden. Pokagon was baptized in 1830 as Leopold Pokagon. His wife Gatas was baptized as Elizabeth Topnabee. In 1833, at the Treaty of Chicago, the government was supplying whiskey in order to get the leaders drunk so that they would sign away their land without negotiating. Pokagon saw through this. He tried to advise other leaders not to indulge. Pokagon did not sign on the first day, but negotiated. Due to our political stance in the region, our relationship with the Catholic Church, and our ways of adopting agriculture and life, we were able to stay in the territory of Michigan. This, however, was under the agreement that we would be removed to La Arbor Croche, or present-day Harbor Springs, Michigan. This was to happen by 1838. By the time that came around, there was no room there. Pokagon and his people pooled monies together from these treaties. They bought land in Silver Creek, north of Dowagiac. He then deeded 40 acres of land to the Catholic Church. Pokagon died in 1841, and he is buried under the right front corner of the church. He had many children from 2 different marriages. His first wife, Ekonyat, was the daughter of Sawak. Sawak was the brother to Topnaby. After her death, he married Gates, daughter of Topnaby, who later became Elizabeth Topnaby. Their youngest son together was Simon Pokagon. This video was put together to show you just a few pieces of our Potawatomi history. Our band only holds a small sliver of the history of our Potawatomi nation, where across the Great Lakes area there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of villages.
Okay.
Well, now, hold on a second.
For centuries, historians imagined the ancient Amazon as a wilderness. No civilization.
Okay. Is that up for you guys? Yeah.
Okay, does anybody have any like thoughts or questions or anything on that portion? Yeah,
So some churches in the area, some churches around the country are developing statements they can use in their liturgy to acknowledge that Indigenous people were living on areas where Indigenous people were. And someone told me that we as white Europeans or whatever, we think of property ownership as the way we sort of think of things. So we try and put Native people in that same sort of box. So we try and determine where we live, be really focused on what the tribes were that lived here. But someone pointed out to me that Native people didn't really think about land ownership. They didn't think of owning the land. So what they said is, don't be too preoccupied with that, because Native people were always moving, like in the south tip of Lake Michigan, a lot of Native peoples would be moving throughout the year. So that's why there would be multiple tribes that would be in our area at particular times of the year. So when we try and make a statement to acknowledge, we shouldn't be too overly focused on maybe knowing exactly which tribes.
yeah, so
So
that
is that accurate or?
sort of, it's a really good line of thought. So the question was about like land ownership and land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements, let's start there. So land acknowledgements have become rather popular in recent years. Some Indigenous people refuse to do them. I will do them, but there are like a lot of rules if I'm going to help somebody with a land acknowledgement. So typically what happens in a land acknowledgement is that a group or an institution will come forward and say, we would like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land whose building, or whose land our building is set upon. And that's great. It's great to acknowledge the original people who lived here. However, you need to follow that up with some action. If you're not doing anything to level the playing field and to right those wrongs, then really that's all just performative. And who is that even for? It doesn't benefit us. We know this is this is our homelands. We're already aware. Most people already are aware that this country originally was inhabited by other people. So you need to do something. And oftentimes when I tell people that you need to follow that land acknowledgement up with some action, sometimes people get really offended. And they say to me things like, well, I can't be held responsible for the things that my ancestors did. And that's true. You can't be held responsible for the things that your ancestors did, but it is really important to acknowledge that you still actively benefit from those things to this day. So maybe you didn't physically kick an Indigenous person off of their land, but you benefit because that happened. And there are Indigenous people today who are still suffering because that happened. And I think we tend to get lost in this idea of America being like the greatest country on earth. And maybe it is for some people, but it's certainly not for us. And it's certainly not for many people of color. And it's really important to acknowledge that what looks like paradise to some people is really post-apocalyptic to a lot of other people. And so maybe you didn't, colonize the land yourself, but you benefit from it. And so it's important to try in some way to level that playing field and to right some of those wrongs. So doing things like what we're doing today, giving an Indigenous woman a platform and listening to her, that's a huge step in the right direction. Giving back to the communities in whatever way you can, whether that's resources, time, money, whatever, that's also really important too. And the other question was about land ownership. It is true that we didn't really feel like land was something you could own. It's like saying that you own the air. That's a really weird concept to a lot of Native people, because to us, this earth, this is our mother, right? It's our life force. This is what sustains us as people. And so we have a responsibility to this earth. We don't own it. That's absurd. This earth and this land, and really all of Creator's creations would be a lot better off without us human beings. So we have a responsibility and an obligation to care for it and to care for all of creation. And so a lot of Native people did migrate quite a bit as well. Not all tribes did. Not all Native people were nomadic. Pokagon and Potawatomi people were sort of nomadic in the sense that we traveled along the Great Lakes, depending on the time of year or for trade. But traditionally speaking, like this is our homelands, this area here. So if you're doing land acknowledgements, it's good to look up who would have traditionally called this spot home, whether it was just for a season or whether it was permanently. And just like, as long as you're putting forth your best effort to do these things in earnest and with a good heart, then that's what really matters. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Yeah, yes.
There's the sins of our nation go way back, and there's a movement not much acknowledged by European white people that there ought to be reparations paid to African Americans who were brought here as slaves and to Native peoples. Is that something that you or people in your tribe would be interested in? And what do you do about that, if anything?
That was a good question. So that question was about reparations for both the Indigenous and the African American communities. I personally am very pro reparations. I think that is kind of like the least that can be done, because it's important to remember that this country was built, really bought and paid for with the blood of Indigenous people and the enslaved African people who were brought here to build this country. And then after this country was built, we did not benefit really in any way, shape, or form. And it continues to still oppress Indigenous and Black people of color. And so it's really important, I guess, when having these conversations, to recognize first that it is very nuanced and that there are people on both sides of the coin who may have different opinions. But ultimately, I think it's really important to acknowledge where we were, and I obviously cannot speak for the African American, for people that, because I'm not African American, but just speaking from an Indigenous perspective, our people, we had paradise prior to colonization, and there were conflicts and there were hardships sometimes, but ultimately we had paradise, we had peace, we had, we were in control of our own lives. And now every day when we walk out our doors, we have to see highways and fast food restaurants and all of these things that our people were slaughtered for, and that in a lot of these spaces, education and health and law, these are spaces that we're excluded from a lot of the time. So all of these like great things that make America such a wonderful place to live often don't really benefit or apply to Indigenous people. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it specifically states that none of this was ever intended for Indigenous people. In fact, it refers to us as merciless Indian savages to this day. Like that's never been rectified or changed. So it's very clear that this was never intended to benefit us. And that a lot of times within these spaces, we are still seen as like subhuman. And a lot of people, I think, are under the impression that maybe the Indian Wars ended a long time ago, and they did in a way, in a sense, like we're not fighting on the battlefield anymore, but we are still being fought in courtrooms, in classrooms, in hospital rooms, in all of these places that are supposed to uphold equality and justice, but purposefully exclude us. And so when we talk about reparations, you have to think about where we were prior to colonization and all of these obstacles that are in our past to even today that keep us from having this, American dream that America is supposed to be all about. Just like kind of going off on a side tangent here. One of the things that really impacts us today as Indigenous people is the lack of representation. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, when you guys turn on your TV every day, most people see other individuals who look like them or who speak their language. When you turn on the radio, you hear songs that are being sung in a language that you understand and that is native to you. Indigenous people don't have that luxury. It wasn't until a couple years ago, if you guys have Hulu, there's a show called Reservation Dogs. I don't know if anybody's seen it. And it's a really funny show and it's a good show, but a lot of people don't understand how revolutionary that was for us. Because that's like the first time in my entire life that I have seen widespread accurate Indigenous representation. That's exactly how we are. Everybody who I know who watched that show knows somebody exactly like each of those characters and the things that they talk about, the slang that they use even, those are all, that's like real. You could tell that that was a show written by Native people for Native people, but we've never had that before, like ever. And so when we continue to exclude Indigenous people from these spaces, from pop culture, from media, from everything else, and we continue to contribute to the erasure of Indigenous people in our own homelands. Like there are people who don't even realize that we still exist. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've been told, oh, I didn't know you people were still around. Or, oh, well, you don't look Indian. Like, oh, okay, well, how am I supposed to look? Because I do, And so there's like this, I think Adam Beach said it best when he said they love us in the 1800s. They love to think of us as, on horseback on the battlefield, living in teepees, but we're not all from the plains. We all look very different. And so when we have a lack of representation, people don't realize who we actually are. And when we are erased, it makes it a lot easier to continue to subjugate and oppress Indigenous people. For example, the missing and murdered Indigenous women pandemic, if anybody's familiar with that, we're 10 times more likely than any other demographic in this country to be the victims of violence and murder. And over 90% of the time, that's at the hands of non-Indigenous people. And of the 600 something, our cases don't get reported as much as they should. Since 2018, I think there were only 600 cases reported and less than a dozen actually got investigated. They don't look for us when we go missing. They don't care. They see us as being like these lost, hopeless, savage people. They don't realize that we are modern, contributing members of society. We are mothers, we are fathers, and we're doctors and lawyers and CEOs. But even if we were none of those things, we are people and we matter regardless. So it's really important to acknowledge that we are still here, Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. I don't know if that really even answered your question.
I'm interested in it because,
Yeah.
Until we as a nation deal with what we've done to Native peoples and to people who were brought here against their will, we have this, we're not going to be able to move ahead until we deal with that. And I don't see a lot of effort being done, at least by the powers that be. And I wondered if you had any particular ideas about how that, you know, it's our responsibility
Mhm.
probably as white European folks to figure out what we might do.
Yeah,
But do you have some ideas about
yeah.
what might assist in the building the wealth that you were deprived of
Yeah.
and whatnot?
Yeah, that was a really good question. And I do want to acknowledge also, I understand that conversations like this can be really uncomfortable to have. And the intention here is not to like blame or make anybody feel bad, but I mean, it is uncomfortable because it is what it is. And I think it's really important that we have the conversations anyways. And I think real growth happens in those uncomfortable spaces. So I wanted to thank everybody for being open to this dialogue also. So when it comes to reparations and like, you know, giving back and returning some of what was stolen, there's a movement happening within, particularly within Indigenous communities and with our allies called the Land Back movement. And land back, I want to preface, is very nuanced. It means very different things for a lot of people. Regardless though, if an Indigenous person has an opinion on it, that opinion is valid. And that's really for us to be determining like what that looks like or what that doesn't within our own communities. But for myself, what land back looks like is a return of stewardship of these lands to Indigenous people. That can mean doing things like, you know, if we return stewardship of these lands, perhaps the taxes that you pay on your property go to the Indigenous nations instead of to like the United States government. It could mean, you know, when you pass on, your plan could be to leave a plot of land or whatever you might own to the Indigenous communities who originally lived here. It could mean a lot of different things. But ultimately, I think it's important to acknowledge that we know what's best for this land because we lived here successfully for thousands and thousands of years prior to colonization. And it really wasn't until post-colonization that we started to see a lot of problems with the climate, with food insecurity, with homelessness and poverty and all these other things. And so, you know, that's not like a simple solution. There isn't really one right, easy answer. But ultimately putting that stewardship back in our hands is the first step in the right direction, in my opinion. Yes.
I don't know whether you have seen the film or read the book, The Killers of the Flower Moon. I don't know, have you seen or read the book? I mean, read the book or seen the movie? Yeah, so Killers of the Flower Moon, I think I have not watched it personally. I know it deals with the Osage and basically there's oil. Was like the whole big dispute. It boiled down to oil and money. And a lot of Osage people were murdered, lost their lives because other people felt that they deserved control of that because they wanted the money. I have not watched it just because like I'm a little bit emotional. I think it would make me really be a struggle to get through that movie. Yeah. But that is also a really good example of Indigenous stories being told in a really meaningful and powerful way. And Indigenous people being given opportunities to act and produce and to design. Lily Gladstone herself is such a powerhouse. We all love her in Indigenous country because she goes on the red carpet and she wears dresses that were designed by Native people and she wears quill work and beadwork and all of these things. And so she gives back to her community in that way. But yeah, I have not watched the movie, no. I mean, I've read the book.
Yeah.
It was really hard to read.
Yeah. There's another one. I think HBO made a movie out of it, but it was a book first, and it's called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. If anybody's ever seen that or read it, that was another really tough one that dealt with the Battle of Wounded Knee. And this is not like Potawatomi history particularly, but sort of. A lot of people don't realize that there was actually a second battle that took place at Wounded Knee in the 1970s. So like not that long ago within some of our lifetimes, where basically there was a shootout, there was a battle that happened between the FBI and some Indigenous people who were, they were resisting colonization. And there's a man who's in prison today, still, who was sent to prison for the killing of 2 of those FBI agents. His name is Leonard Peltier. If you guys don't know who Leonard Peltier is, I definitely recommend reading up on him. He's a very old man now and he's in very poor health and he's still sitting in prison. And there's like a lot of evidence he didn't do it wasn't him. But Leonard Peltier was a leader within AIM, the American Indian Movement. So he was an extremely influential resistance fighter for our people. And so he's classified as a political prisoner. People such as like Gandhi and Mother Teresa, I think even the Queen Elizabeth, I think at one point in time even spoke out on his behalf, which is like very kind of surprising. And so there's a lot of calls for him to be released from prison, but none of it's been heard. We had a lot of hope with President Obama because he put out, he claimed to want to build a lot of bridges and rebuild some of those relationships with Indigenous people. But he never would address Leonard Peltier or the situation that's happening there. So that's another very interesting piece of history to research later if you want to learn more. Yeah, yes.
I think you know that the current Department of Interior is this person.
Deb Holland.
And they have not raised that point either.
Yeah, and that's another actually kind of interesting conversation that's happening within Indigenous America right now, is there are a lot of influential Indigenous people who have platforms now who have not spoken out on behalf of Leonard Peltier. And I think some people do have different opinions on AIM, the movement in general, and Leonard Peltier. So I don't know why Deb hasn't spoken up. I personally do feel that she should, but I don't know. There's other people who feel that she shouldn't. So, yeah. Anyone else?
A related question then is, has the Pokagon Band seen any change in terms of having Deb Holland as the Secretary of the Interior? And, through the BIA, I mean, obviously Pokagon Band is a sovereign nation, separate from the US.
Yeah. Yeah. So that brings up another point that's also very nuanced, is sovereignty, and we can talk about that more for a second. So Deb Holland, being the Secretary of the Interior, she fights pretty hard for Indigenous issues. In particular, it wasn't Pokagon Band specifically, but for ICWA. ICWA was about to be overturned not too long ago. Is anybody familiar with ICWA? It's the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so what that states is that Indigenous children stay with Indigenous families. So personal connection is that I'm only the second generation in my family to be allowed to raise my own children. I brought my son here with me today. He's outside playing with my cousin, but I brought him here today to kind of make that point. Everyone prior to that in my family was was in a residential school. So my great grandmother, my grandpa, my uncles, a lot of my family prior to me, they survived Mount Pleasant Residential School, which was the deadliest in the United States. So far, we don't really have an exact number. And so what ICWA came about after that, the residential schools, and just for some context, the last school did not close until 1996. Friends was in its second season, just to give that a little bit of reference there. So these things that are happening or have happened, it's also not ancient history. That's really important to remember. I know people in their 50s who suffered in these schools. Schools is also a very loose term. They didn't have playgrounds, they had graveyards at these schools. And the original intention of those schools was literally word for word, kill the Indian to save the man. And so if they couldn't, get the Indian out of the child, then they would kill that child. And so after, in the 1960s, there was also something called the scoop. And so during the scoop, what happened was a lot of Indigenous children were taken forcefully from their families and sent out to live with white families. And any records of their family, their birth parents and their Indigenous history was erased. So there are a lot of people out there today who don't even know where they came from or that they're Indigenous. And so that was another attempt at assimilation. And so ICWA came about in an attempt to prevent that. And ICWA states that Indigenous children stay with Indigenous families. So if there is an Indigenous child who needs to be removed from their home or who is orphaned or whatever, that they should stay with Native families. However, a couple of years ago, there was a white family who said that they felt called by God to save Indigenous children. And so they adopted illegally an Indigenous little girl, and they felt that they had the right to raise her to be a good Christian and that should supersede ICWA, that was more important. And so the lawyers who took on her case actually represent the same pipeline, Keystone Pipeline. which is like a whole other thing. But there's a lot of pipelines that go through Indigenous lands. And so the lawyers who represented that project actually decided to take on and try to overturn ICWA on behalf of this family. And so to your question, Deb Holland actually was a very vocal advocate for not overturning that. And thanks to her, their attempt was unsuccessful. And so ICWA stands. But there was a time when Indigenous people, like just 2 years ago, we were all very scared. And, you know, I have a little boy, he's 6 now. At the time he was 4. And so I had to sit down and have a really difficult conversation with his father. Like, what happens if ICWA is overturned? Could this impact us? Could somebody come for our child? We don't know. So thanks in large part to Deb Holland's efforts, it was not successful. I see all the way in the back.
Yeah, are you familiar with, the recent, land to trust for the, Prairie Band, Potawatomi in Illinois?
Yeah, I actually just read about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not really familiar with all the details of that, but I do know that a large chunk of land was just placed back into trust with Prairie Band Potawatomi, who are our relatives. And basically what that means is that's sovereign land. So we're now, it's like a separate entity from the United States, which was something else that we were kind of asked about just then. But that's like a whole other thing is sovereignty. The United States government claims that we have sovereignty over our own lands, but it is all heavily regulated by the BIA, which you had mentioned, and there's rules to it. And it talks about this kind of in this PowerPoint at some point, but our religion and our languages, that was all illegal until 1978. We would face jail time if we wanted to dance or speak our language or pray to our creator. You know, it's in my mother's generation, right? And so when it comes to our sovereignty, there's a lot of rules there. So keeping in mind that our way of life was illegal until 1978, our sovereignty also depends on us living traditionally. So even though it was illegal to speak our language until then, and even though many of our parents and grandparents were sent to residential schools where it was literally beaten out of them, we are now being told that if we don't have enough fluent language speakers, that we lose our sovereignty. And so it's like, well, kind of set us up for failure there, hey? So that's like this other argument or other big thing that we have to deal with as Indigenous people, you know, is we're very lucky within our communities that we do have a lot of language speakers and language keepers like Kyle, who did the video for us just there. And there are a lot of people who are revitalizing that effort to learn. My own grandfather, his name was Sam, he was a fluent speaker, but he was also a residential school survivor. And so he didn't teach my mom or my aunties because he lived in a time where to be Indigenous was like a death sentence almost, and he was terrified. And so he didn't teach them a lot of things. And so now it's on my generation to kind of pick that up for ourselves and try to learn ourselves. Yeah, and so sovereignty is like another issue, I guess, that we're facing today. And I don't mean for it all to sound so negative, because I think that we are very resilient people. And I think we've done a very good job of returning to our traditional ways of life and to not lose those things. But we're also like very tired of having to be resilient. You know, we like myself as an Indigenous mother, I never get to just relax into motherhood because I have to always be worried now, is ICWA going to be overturned? Are we going to lose our sovereignty? Is something going to happen to my child because he is other? You know, we don't have that privilege of just being able to exist without somebody bothering us. You know, people feel sometimes often also very entitled to us and to our knowledge and to our ways. People, you know, like you guys today have been so wonderful. You know, you invited me into your space and you're listening, and that's so huge. And I appreciate that so much. But oftentimes what people will do is they'll just show up into our spaces. They'll show up at our ceremonies or at powwows or at our political meetings, and they'll like demand to have a voice. Or they'll take things that were taught to them freely and then they'll go and teach classes and charge people for it. And now they're profiting off of stolen knowledge. And it's like, we just want to be, you know, we don't sell our knowledge, we give it, you know. If somebody really wants to come to powwow and learn, we will teach them just like anybody else. And so it's very frustrating, that level of entitlement that people feel also. Yeah, sorry, that was like another tangent. What other questions do we have?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So like during the video that you showed,
Mhm.
the gentleman spoke about, getting indigenous people drunk and, selling, having them sign documents to
Mhm.
sell their land. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was actually a very common tactic of the United States government because prior to colonization, we actually didn't have alcohol. We didn't have dairy either, so fun fact is like 80% of Native people are lactose intolerant. But anyway, yeah, so we didn't have alcohol and we're particularly susceptible to alcohol's effects on us. And so what they would do is they would get leaders together and get them drunk and have them sign away their land. And this ties back into the question about land ownership. To us, we were like, you can't own the land, idiots. Like, okay, we'll sign your paper because it like was not, that didn't make sense, and on top of that, they got a lot of our leaders drunk. And so it was definitely some very shady tactics it's land theft is what that is. And beyond that, even though people sign treaties, all of those treaties have been broken. None of them have been honored anyway. So it's like, okay, I don't know why we were put all through that if it was just gonna be taken anyways. One popular example of that is Chicago. Chicago itself comes from an indigenous word from a Potawatomi word, Dowagiac, which describes, so way back in the day, prior to colonization, Chicago was an important stop on our trade route, but there were a lot of wild onions that grew there, and they were kind of stinky. And then at the end of the season, they would start to rot, and then they were even more stinky. And so that word describes that smell of rotting wild onions. Yeah, a little bit of history for you there. So Chicago, though, there was a treaty where we signed over our land there, the 1833, I believe, Treaty of Chicago. And then after that treaty was signed, the city and the state of Illinois came in and they created land, like 3 miles of land that stretched from where the lake shore was, and they expanded it out. We didn't agree to that. That's not part of the treaty. There was nothing in there that said that they could do that. And so in 1912, the Potawatomi, we took them to court and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But being that it was like, 1912, yeah, we were not successful. And so there are actually some pushes to have that land returned to us now. But that land is like the Magnificent Mile and all that real expensive, real profitable lakefront. So, take that into consideration. But yeah, that's just like another example of people being very shady and taking from indigenous people and then acting like we're ridiculous when we call them out on it. So, yeah. Yes.
How and when are children named?
That's a really good question. The question was about naming. So that's going to be different for everybody. So my son, when he was born, was given just like, a regular name. And then our Anishinaabe names, sometimes referred to as our spirit names. We have a belief that because when you go on to the other side, our ancestors and creator, they don't speak English. They only speak our language. And so we have to have a name so that they can understand us and who we are. But also that name is representative of who we are in like every lifetime. And so some people actually very closely guard that name. They won't give it to everybody. For that reason, because that's just like so intimate to know that part of somebody. So for myself, like I said, my mom was not raised in our traditional ways. And my mom and my auntie is very proud to be Anishinaabe, but we're not raised in those ways. So I didn't receive a name until I was, I think I've seen my son. Anyway, so I didn't receive my name until I was an adult, and my son received his actually just a few months ago. So it's really up to each individual. Some people never want to pursue that, and they never want to have that given to them.
Received it by whom?
Yeah, by one of our healers or our helpers, one of our spiritual people. So that's a whole ceremony in and of itself. But basically, it's given to us by a spiritual leader.
How do you decide what name to give you based on your personality, based on?
Sort of. So that's a little bit of a closed practice, but essentially what they do is they pray and they ask Creator who we are, and then it's given to them that way. Mm-hmm. Yep. And yeah. I was hoping my son would sit still for this, but I don't think he's going to. So yeah. What other questions?
So if you don't have somebody, sorry.
Yeah, no.
If you don't have somebody leading, what are the chiefs' involvement?
Yeah, so we don't really have chiefs in like us in particular.
Because that video thing said.
Yeah, so that's actually a way, the term chief was, in my understanding, created to sort of make sense to the colonizers. That we had people who we looked up to, but decisions were not made by any one in particular person. And actually, I was always told also that we were more of a matriarchy. So maybe our chiefs would go and like negotiate, but they would come home and ask their wives about it, you know? Yeah, I agree, as it should be. So yeah, so the term chief in and of itself is a product of colonization. More likely what we would call ourselves would be like a helper than a chief. Yes.
Do you still face resistance to hold on to your own beliefs, knowing that in the past, a lot of those residential schools used religion as a way to make you American and lose your indigenous religions?
Yeah, so that question, if you guys couldn't hear, was about the impacts of the residential schools, and how that impacts us with our like religious and cultural beliefs. So because of the residential schools, my grandpa, he raised my mother and my aunties as Catholics. And then I was raised in a church, actually, and it wasn't until I became an adult that I found that freedom and that courage to go back and seek out a more traditional Anishinaabe way of life. But that was a huge internal battle. There's like this major identity crisis that a lot of Indigenous people go through because of that. And it is a personal choice. It is different for everybody. I know plenty of Indigenous people who still identify as Catholic or Christian or what have you. And that is their decision to make. And that is totally valid, and I respect that. However, for myself personally, it wasn't really until I had my son that I realized the importance of holding on to my culture. And I've always been extremely proud to be Anishinaabe, but I was also raised in a church that was not accepting of Anishinaabe people. I grew up being told that I was going to burn in hell if I didn't turn my back on my people, and all my ancestors were burning in hell and all this other really scary stuff. And so that's also an issue that a lot of Indigenous people face, is we get told a lot that if we, you know, honor our ancestors, that we've done something wrong, that's a sin. And I just remember it being like a young woman, that didn't make sense to me. It just wasn't sitting right with me, and I couldn't understand why. And then I had my son, and I looked at my son and I just imagined if he had been born 50 years prior, he probably would have been taken from me and sent to a school. And that's when I realized just how much people sacrifice just so that we could exist. You know, the fact that I'm standing here today, the fact that I exist, that's resistance in and of itself. And the fact that I am a mother and I'm raising my child to be Anishinaabe, that's resistance. But there are still times when I find myself questioning, like, am I gonna go to hell? Yeah, and it's something that a lot of Native people deal with all the time, because it gets so ingrained into us from the minute that we're born that we are inherently bad, that we need somebody to come and save us and to come and fix us. And we get that in the classroom. We get that from some of the adults in our lives, you know? And so each Indigenous person, we have a choice to make at some point in time. You know, do we want to stay on this path that we're on, or do we want to go back to a more traditional way of life, you know? And so that kind of ties back into that walking in two worlds, is how do you like reconcile those two things? Because, you know, I had been very convinced my whole life growing up that there was one answer, that was it. And then I had to be in a church and I had to pray to God, and I could not call him creator, and I could not pray in my language. And then I got older and I had my son, and I realized how important it was for me to sit in ceremony and to learn my language. And then there were times when the teachings that you get from both places, they conflict, they don't really line up. And so what do? You know, and unfortunately, there's not an easy answer to that. Yeah. I'm sorry, I saw one hand go up back first, and then I think I saw yours also. So there, and then here. Sorry. White shirt, yes.
Okay, thank you. So a few years ago, well, longer than that, about 10 years ago, maybe, I did a book study with a group called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. And in that book, she spoke to growing up with these ideas of Indigenous people being alcoholics and blah, blah, blah. Okay. I had never heard those, and I'm obviously coming from a place of privilege. I've never heard those stereotypes before, and I was really taken aback.
Yeah.
Fast forward now 10 years or so, my daughter's in college in Alma, Michigan, which is 20 minutes away from the Mount Pleasant boarding school.
Yeah.
She takes a course on Indigenous people, and they go to the boarding school, and she doesn't know what to do. She's 20 years old and is just hearing about this. What is being done? Do you know? Or how can we have this become part of what is taught to the children in school? Because this is history. This isn't, you know, who's getting to tell this story, and are the voices of the oppressed being heard? You know, I keep coming back to that. And now our son is a junior in high school, and as she started to share all that she has learned, our son was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know, he was blown away, and now he wants to learn. And he has asked, what can I do as a white boy to say, hey, we really need to be talking about this in our education system. This is factual.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's about, how do we teach people the truth about what happened to Indigenous people in this country? You talk about it, first of all, so coming to things like this is huge. Telling people that you know what you learned today, that's huge. Reaching out to your school's administration and asking, can we teach these things? A lot of times this gets put into a conversation like critical race theory is the hot button issue, right? I think calling it that is like very divisive in and of itself, because it's just the facts. It's just what happened. That's what happened. And I understand that these may be very hard topics to talk about, and it may seem scary to children sometimes, but we need to learn and we need to understand, because if we don't understand history, it's going to repeat itself, right? And so it almost right now seems like it has to happen. It starts in the home. Having those conversations with our children. My tribe does also offer a lot of educational resources, our Center for History and Culture, that we prepared for schools. But Mount Pleasant in particular, I think it's in June, they do a memorial there, which anybody can attend. It's almost exclusively Indigenous people attending right now, but anybody can come and you can learn and you can see it for yourself. Some of the things that happen there. Like I know, I went last year, and one thing that I saw is they had like a stable, like a blacksmith shop where they would do horseshoes and stuff. And they had these rings outside where they would tie the horses up to fit them with shoes or whatever, but they would also tie the kids up. And so you could see like scratch marks in brick from these little children. And a lot of times I think people hear about these schools and they think, oh, well, they were just there to learn English or to learn. No, they weren't. It was horrific, the things that these children endured there. So you can go see it. You can go touch these places. You can hear from survivors. We have survivors that come to these and speak. You can hear from the grandchildren and the children of these individuals. And then you can go home and you can tell your family what you learned, and you can call your schools, call your state representatives, and your elected officials, and demand that this sort of knowledge be made public and accessible. 'Cause I think hiding it isn't serving anybody. And then, sorry, I saw back here first.
Okay, two worlds, two cultures, casinos, good or bad?
Oh, so the question is about casinos. How do we feel about casinos? I personally think good. So there's a lot of like gambling and games that would take place in our cultures prior to colonization anyways. Like we would bet on foot races and hand games and all sorts of stuff, and it was a way that we socialized. So like there is a actually relevant cultural context there. Our casinos are extremely regulated by the BIA and by the federal government. So they have to operate like as casinos, you know. But they also bring a lot of revenue into our communities as well. And so that's one way that we're able to be self-sustaining. Because I think something that we hear as Indigenous people a lot is there's this misconception that we get like free money from the government, or like we don't have to pay taxes. And that's not true. Like I file my taxes just like everybody else, and I have to pay my way through life just like everybody else. The government doesn't give us money, actually, the way that we are able to build like our government facilities and things like that. and provide healthcare. It's all through revenue that we get from the casinos. And we are currently diversifying. A lot of Native people are, because I think casinos are starting to fall out of favor, like culturally, within America, which is valid. I get that too. Sometimes people develop addictions and things like that. And we do have a lot of resources available to help people, but even that is regulated by the government. Like, we're not ever allowed to approach somebody and say, hey, you've been sitting at this machine for 24 hours straight. Are you okay? We can't do that. We'll get in trouble. And so we can have those resources available, but we can't encourage people to get help, which is really interesting. And so, yeah, so that's always like, there is a downside, I guess, to those. But overall, it's done a tremendous amount of good for Indigenous people. And then I think I saw you and then you. Yes.
Are you willing to share about your tattoos, and are they culturally related?
Yeah, my tattoos are not, for the most part, culturally related. Some of them are like references to things, and like I have one of my grandpa. But yeah, tattooing, as I was told, varies from tribe to tribe. Different nations have different practices. I don't know much about tattooing in Potawatomi culture, other than that we would tattoo like our warriors and stuff before they went into battle as a way of identification, sort of like a dog tag sort of thing. But they also could tell like different parts of your life or different status things that you've achieved, like marriage or having children or whatever. And there is actually an artist, his name is David Martin. If you guys don't know who that is, go Google him. He's incredibly fantastic as well, but he's Pokagon and he's a tattoo artist. And he's been doing some research into like traditional tattooing practices as well. So maybe sometime in the future, we'll have more information available through folks like that.
We're talking about history. When I was in 8th grade, which was 50-some years ago, Indiana education required a unit of Indiana history and civics. And before I came here today, I've heard all about in that class, about the Potawatomi and Miami and the Sauk and indigenous people around here. And I'm wondering though, if that is still taught today or still a requirement that you have to have a unit of Indiana history.
That's a good question. I don't know. My son's only in kindergarten, so and I did go.
Definitely not civics. Civics is not being taught.
Interesting.
I think 4th grade is history.
I can speak to it. No. I'm actually an elementary teacher.
Okay.
Currently teaching. My specialization is in music, but I also have a generalist license, so I do know the requirements that are currently on the books. A few years ago, about 5 years ago, a change in legislation actually removed the requirement for state history to be taught because it is not officially a tested subject. And in order to allow more time for literacy subjects that they argued you needed the literacy in English, you needed the literacy in math, which are tested areas. Some schools select to continue to do that because they feel it's important to know the history of your area in order to be a citizen in that area. But the state of Indiana no longer requires it. There are many teachers that do still do some unit. I can speak to my district. I teach in Portage. They actually do a small unit and include a trip to Indianapolis to have a connection where they visit the State House, visit the Children's Museum, visit the State Museum to get some history and culture connected to the state, but it is no longer a requirement.
Interesting. Okay. Sorry, talking back there.
You mentioned powwows. Are visitors welcome?
Yes, that's a great. We love visitors at powwow. Yes. So actually Memorial Day weekend, my tribe hosts one in Dowagiac. It's a traditional one, which means it's not competition style. So there's traditional powwows and then there's competition. So the one happening Memorial Day weekend in Dowagiac is a traditional one. It's much smaller than some other powwows are, but we have, there's typically an MC or an arena director, and they'll explain to you the different dances and the different songs and the different things that they mean. If anybody's interested in attending a powwow, yes, please come. Bring cash, because a lot of the food vendors don't take cards, and you definitely want to try the food. And there's like different things that we make that we sell there too, so you can support Indigenous economy that way, and learn a lot about the culture that way. I would just say, like, just some basic etiquette rules is those events are always drug and alcohol free. Don't take a picture of somebody without asking. And then just if the arena director directs you to do something, like during honor songs and things, they'll typically ask you to stand and remove your hats. Just try to, like, yeah, be respectful in that way. Yeah.
How would we find out about that?
So you can go to Pokagon Band website. So if you just look up Pokagon Band, it's there. Yeah.
That was my question. Do you have a website?
Yes, we do. Yep. So if you Google search Pokagon Band, you'll find my tribe's website, and we do have a list of usually upcoming events that way. In the back.
Yeah, could you talk about repatriation and the stealing of artifacts and the desecration of burial sites and how the Pokagon community deals with it?
Yeah, so the question is about repatriation. So we do actually have a branch of our government and individuals, that's their whole job. And then we have a committee as well, the Traditions and Repatriations Committee, who deal with those issues specifically. But I think the biggest problem that we face is with like collectors and museums who feel very entitled to our things, and even to the remains of some of our ancestors. A few years ago, there was a young girl her remains were in some museum somewhere. And we found out and we brought her home, but it was like a battle. People fight us on these things, which is just absurd to me. Like, imagine if I went into your home and stole your grandma's urn that she was in and then was like, oh, this belongs to me now. Like, that's crazy, but that's essentially what people have done to us throughout history. And then they'll argue, well, we know how to care for these things better than you guys do. You don't have the resources to take care of them. Okay, well, first of all, whose fault is that? And second of all, we actually do. We had cared for these things for thousands of years before anybody else arrived on these shores. So yeah, anytime that we ask for our things back, it's usually a fight. People don't want to give our things back to us. And they make us jump through all these hoops and go to court and get lawyers and like cite very specific parts of laws just to have our own things back. And then there's the argument of, well, it's in a museum, it's educational, people can learn this way. So what? That's our stuff. That's not your stuff. And they belong with our people. And, I think a lot of people would find that we're very happy to share. Like the things that I have on this table up here, these were lent to me by my tribe's archives, our Center for History and Culture. Like, we will show you, we will share, but that doesn't mean that, you can't just take them. Yeah, Yes.
I have two questions. One, how are you learning, or have you already learned your language, your native language? And secondly, are there any, if there are any children's books about indigenous people and whatnot? There are indigenous children, who are, well, they're partially indigenous. So just curious.
Yeah.
About the language part and the book part.
Yeah, so let's do the book part first. So there are actually a lot of books written by Native people about for Native children, or I guess for anybody to read. I think there's one artist, David Martin, the man who I mentioned earlier, his son Eron wrote a book, and it's in Bodewasmik, which is our language, and English, and it describes like a day at the powwow. So it follows a family getting ready for a powwow. So there's things like that are available. Again, my tribe's Center for History and Culture and our education department have a lot of these books, and could probably send recommendations or tell you where to buy them if you were to reach out. We're so happy to share that. And then there's also a woman in our tribe, her name is Eron, and she started an Indigenous Kids Book Club. It's called Mkozmboken. So MKOS space MBOKEN. You can find them on Facebook or Instagram, I think, too. And they have a lot of Indigenous children book recommendations there as well. The second question was about language and how did I learn it, or am I learning it? So it's still a learning curve for me. I'm still in the process of figuring it out. If your primary language is English, then Bodewasmik can seem really complicated. I think if it was my first language, it would probably, it makes more sense when you think about it, but in practice, it's hard when you keep trying to apply English rules to a non-English language, But we do have, like, we have classes that we offer that citizens can take. And there's also an app called Mango. Mango is a free app, and there is a Bodewasmik course on Mango that is free. So anybody could take it and learn it that way too. But yeah, my son does a lot better with the language than I do. I think 'cause he's still young and it's been really normalized for him, but I didn't grow up with it. My grandpa was a fluent speaker, but he passed on when I was 12. And so like the first word that I ever learned in our language, for example, was mbish, and mbish means water. And it was easy to remember because it sounded like beach, right? But he also taught to me that that was the most important thing I had to learn, because the water's life. That's like, that is what sustains us. And so he made sure that I understood that before anything else. And then the next thing that I learned was how to introduce myself in the language, which I did at the beginning of the presentation. And I was taught always that whenever I enter a new space, to always introduce myself in the language. First of all, because, I should be Indigenous out loud and letting people know who I am, but also because any of the ancestors who might be in these spaces, they probably don't speak English and they don't know what I'm here for. And so if I introduce myself in the language, that lets them know who I am and that I'm here in a good way. And so they can kind of come and help and provide some of that guidance that way.
It sounds like your grandfather was very into the beliefs of his culture, but didn't want you to speak.
No,
What was that?
kind of. So my grandpa was a residential school survivor.
Oh, but as part of that.
Yeah.
Okay, what got you into this? I want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
My people.
So, before my grandpa passed away, when I was really young, he never spoke to us about his time at Mount Pleasant.
Kind of like
or-
concentration camp.
Yes, very similar. He never spoke to us about it. But shortly before he passed away, I was going through a really hard time, actually dealing with religion, because at the time, I was like very entrenched in the church, and I was starting to understand that I was Indigenous, and I was starting to see like the conflicts that were happening, and I was
What
struggling.
age would you say this?
I was about 12. And my grandpa said to me, they'll try and take it from you. Don't ever let them take it from you. And I didn't understand what he meant at the time. And it wasn't until I had my son and I looked at my baby and then I realized like, oh, now I understand what he meant by that. But yeah, that was kind of when the seed was planted for me, was then. And I really started to understand that as an Indigenous woman, I am different. And life is hard for me in different ways. Not saying life is not hard for everybody, it's just hard in different ways, and so it was a struggle too, though, because a lot of the people in my life were not Indigenous or not traditional. And so they didn't understand, why I would want to hold on to that part of me. And it did take a lot of time. It took a lot of years to unlearn a lot of the things that I had been taught. Because growing up in America, I think Indigenous children are taught a lot of shame, to be ashamed of who we are and of our ancestors. Somebody mentioned, drunk Indians earlier. And that's a stereotype that our people face. But if I had been through the things that they had been through, I'd probably drink too, to be honest. I thank God for my, ancestors and for those drunk Indians, because they survived. And maybe they did things that people might consider unseemly or uncomfortable to get through, but they got through one way or another, and they did what they had to do. And because of those drunk Indians, I can stand here today in my power as an Indigenous woman and be proud of who I am. So, okay. I saw in the back.
Thank you for this presentation. I truly appreciate it. I have three questions. The first is, so as a leader in your community, how do you address issues as it relates to sovereignty and self-determination, especially in the face of external pressures like government policies that maybe go contrary to tribal interests?
Yeah, so the question was like, how do we deal with sovereignty and self-determination when a lot of legislation and country and regulations in this country are designed to do the opposite of that? And the answer is that you just do it anyway. If you get in trouble, you get in trouble, but you gotta kind of do it anyway. You gotta find a way to do it anyways. And a part of that is having these really uncomfortable conversations too. And like, sometimes, we have to say things to people that we know are gonna make them upset. and that we know might kind of turn them against us, but it has to be said anyways. And so, yeah, you gotta do it anyway. And when the law gets in your way, then you fight it the best that you can. But when you have limited resources, that's also like another difficulty, right? And so that's when you have to really rely on your allies and people who maybe have a platform or have a little bit more power than you to come up and fight for you. But like, for example, we didn't get our sovereignty until 1994, and we had been fighting since like colonization to be recognized, right? It took a long, long time. We were not even considered people under the United States law until 1920 something. So like, it's just, you can't give up. You got to keep going back. And we have a lot of Indigenous people now who are like going to law school, and they're learning the system from the inside out to try and fight it that way too.
My last question is, so from your perspective, how important is identity in unifying, and building unity in your community?
Yeah, identity is everything. Identity is like, they tried to take that from us right away, right? Kill the Indian to save the man. The goal of these residential schools and of reservation systems was to break our spirit and to make us ashamed of who we were. And we were told a lot of the times, well, you can leave the reservation, or, you can do this and that, but you have to assimilate. You have to become good American citizens if you want to do that. And so we lost a lot of our identity along the way. And I'm extremely grateful for my, the people who walked before me for holding on to these ways anyways, because I know that was scary and tough, but identity is everything. Because if I don't know who I am, then how do I know who my ancestors are or what they fought for? If I don't know myself, then how can I know Creator? If I don't know myself, how can I know this language? How can I know this way of life? And even like the language in and of itself, all of our words have a story and a history behind them. It's not like a direct translation, really. Like, for example, our word for hello, we say bonjour or bonjour. And that ties back to our first man that I talked about earlier, Nanak Bojo. We were taught that eventually Nanak Bojo is going to come back to us, but he might not look like a man. He might be, an animal. He might be a woman. He might be a tree. We don't know how he's going to come back to us. So when we greet other living beings, we say Bojo, because we're asking, like, are you him? And so that's a deep part of our history and who we are, and we have to know those things. So yeah, identity is everything. I don't know if that answered that question. Yeah. Yes.
You've been really kind to answer all of our various questions, and I know you had more slides and things like that. Before we run out of time, was there anything that you wanted to say to us that you haven't been able to say yet through the slides or what?
Yeah, so mostly the rest of the slides are just talking about things that we're kind of touching on here. So I don't think we're gonna miss a lot if I don't go through any more of those. So don't worry about that, definitely. I do think the questions are way more important than anything else, really. I think the most important thing that I want people to take away from the conversation today is that Indigenous people, we are varied and unique. We're not a monolith, and that we are very eager to build relationships and to have people learn about us. But it's most important to remember that Indigenous people, we need to be in control of our own narrative. It's not for anybody else to decide what's an honor to us or how to represent us or to tell our stories. We are capable and we want to do these things for ourselves. And so inviting us into places like this is like, we love that. Please keep doing that. Please keep asking us to come and share our stories. Please come to our powwows and learn from us. And please speak up for us, because I do see a lot of people in this room who are white, and there is a privilege and a status that comes with that. Not saying that your lives are not difficult. That's not what that means. It just means that the color of your skin has not been an issue for you the way that it has been for a lot of people. And so people might listen to you more than they'll listen to people of color. So just keep speaking up. I saw here and then here.
I had, the Pope of the Catholic Church has apologized for some of the colonial practices in, I'm familiar with Mexico and whatnot. And I have some vague recollection that the Pope may have said something about the treatment of Native peoples in these schools. And do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar. I feel like he has said something about it, or like there's Truth and Reconciliation in particular in Canada. I think a lot of these conversations didn't become widespread until they discovered the bodies of those children at the school in Canada. And so like, it's great that he maybe said something about it, but what did he do about it?
That was.
You know,
That was
yeah.
the next question, is what is the
Yeah,
church done about
to
it?
my knowledge, nothing. To my knowledge, what happens is it was in particular the Catholic churches that ran these residential schools. And so really they've done nothing. Sometimes we'll have certain leaders from within the Catholic Church, like the Pope and stuff, who will like acknowledge how bad it was, but then they don't do anything about it. So in a lot of Native people's opinion, that's really performative, and we don't care. We don't care that you're sorry, like that doesn't correct it.
Yeah.
You need to do something, help us bring our children home, because a lot of them are still buried. And a lot of times when we try to go and exhume them so we can bring them home, we're stopped. And we're told we're not allowed to do that. And so then it becomes like another legal battle, and it's like, okay, why are we having to fight so hard to bring our children home? You know, so like an apology is nice, I guess, but there's no action behind it, so whatever.
There is a lot of research going on, and they're trying to identify these burials and who they are. Some of these schools got very good records, like education too.
Yeah.
So that research is going to be helpful, I think.
I think it will be. It's also important to acknowledge that a lot of these students passing was marked down as like, oh, well, there was a tuberculosis outbreak, like,
right.
You know, or so there are some records which are extremely helpful. Yeah, and hopefully we're able to get more attention and be able to bring some of our children home, but it is going to require a lot of people to speak up for us too. So nice.
This is a different note.
Yeah.
But could you explain the 7 generations philosophy?
Yeah. Yeah, so that question was about the 7 generations, or the 7th generation prophecy. So prophecy is the word I was looking for earlier. So there was a prophecy way back when, 7 generations ago, actually, to be precise, that said that after 7 generations of living with the white men and living as the white men do, that a great black snake was going to cross Turtle Island. And that it was going to be our young people who were going to rise up and they were going to fight this great black snake. And if we were successful, it meant that there was going to be a return to traditional ways of life for our people, and also that we were going to see land back, that we were going to start seeing some progress towards that, to us taking back, you know, our power, so to speak. And that if we were unsuccessful, that would mean like the end times, really, for the Anishinaabe way of life. And so a lot of people have it, because that is now like my generation, we're the 7th generation from the time of that prophecy. And so there's a lot of belief, and mind you, there are different interpretations of this. So what I'm saying right now is not like law. Other people feel differently about it. But the way that I understand it to be was the Keystone Pipeline, because that stretched from Canada all the way across America. And a lot of people saw that and we were like, that's it. That's the great black snake that they were talking about. And if you look at Standing Rock in 2016, it was our young people who went and fought that pipeline. And actually, to my understanding, that pipeline has since been shut down. So I'd say we were pretty successful there. And now we're seeing a huge return, especially of our young people, to those traditional ways of life. And so you'll hear a lot of people refer to the 7 generations. And so not only is there that prophecy behind it, but it also means like to be a good ancestor. So everything that we do, we have to think 7 generations ahead. How are the things that I'm doing now going to impact 7 generations from now? What kind of a world do I want to leave to them? So it's not so much about doing things to benefit yourself, but doing things to benefit future generations.
Would that we adopt that for the nation?
Right. I think everybody could benefit from thinking that way a little bit. Yeah. What else do we have?
Any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes, and then Madolyn has some things that people can go up and look at or talk more about.
Well, besides thanking the speaker I'm kind of impressed that your organization, NWIAC, sponsored this as their spring forum. I mean, it doesn't exactly pop out at you on your objective or your mission. So I'm just thanking the group for sponsoring.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to you guys too for having me here today. Thank you guys so much. And also, as Pat had said, there are some things up here that you guys can come look at. Some of them are very old, so just like be very careful, don't like pick them up, you know? And then there's a little sheet there that kind of describes what some of the things are. And then there's still some food back there too, I think, so.
Yeah, food, coffee, water, please, if there's.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Conversation. Yeah. Guy.
Different stories about the area.